AI has taken off massively in all areas. And I would say in the data space, it's probably one of the most sort of like prevalent technologies nowadays. I always look for someone that, from a technical perspective, is probably not the best, but can grow, and but not somebody that's technically extremely competent, but can't communicate at all. Be very transparent about where you are, what you've achieved, what are the flaws, what's pending, what's coming up, because the candidate kind of gets excited.
Alex, welcome to the Objective Hiring Show.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim.
It's good to have you here. It's good to have you here. And I feel like you've got the best beard in data. That's already an accolade that you deserve right there. I've got beard envy.
Thank you. You're not the only one that has told me that. So I'm glad.
So, Alex, AI is reshaping everything about the world as we know it at an alarming rate. People are thinking about it in all kinds of context. I'd love to understand your thoughts on AI in hiring. Have you used AI in hiring? Have you seen it already have an impact? And if so, where?
Yeah. No, that is a good question. So in general, AI has taken off massively in all areas. And I would say in the data space, it's probably one of the most sort of like prevalent technologies nowadays. We use it like constantly in various different areas of the business, and even in our like workflow and the life cycle of what we do. But in hiring, I guess it's just as common to use these days. Um, Within the current organization, we don't rely on it too much. And there's an aspect of us checking through a lot of applications, specifically when we kind of go through screening. The idea behind it is to get a bit of a gist of like what types of applicants have actually applied, and it just kind of helps us save time. Well, the one thing that we don't usually do is just have the AI, or in this context, ChatGPT, tell us essentially or score the candidates. So we try to kind of leave that bias out of it. So that's maybe one thing that we are conscious of. And the whole process is very, very much manual. So whilst we do the screening, we don't reject any candidates based on AI. So maybe that's one thing, like how kind of I've seen it used. And again, it's an interesting tool. And maybe on not just the hiring, the screening side, and whilst we may use it, I've seen a lot of candidates use it. A lot of CVs are actually written with AI. It's quite easy to spot, and sometimes even the full application. And there have been candidates that have used AI to actually create to tackle the specific technical assessment, which has caused us a few issues throughout the process. I can tell you a little bit more about it later if you want.
That would be amazing. And yeah, we'll get to the assessment stage. For now, I'm interested in a few things that you mentioned there. So one was that, okay, so you're using ChatGPT at the moment to, I guess, look at the CVs of the candidates and also the application information they might complete. I'm not sure if you have additional kind of questions. And what exactly are you getting it to do? Like, what does the prompt look like without giving away all the secrets?
Well, mostly the context we have built is specifically around who we are. So you can specify who you are as an interviewer. So we kind of do a role play type screening. So we kind of try to pretend that we are the hiring manager. So we kind of teach the GPT just to kind of do exactly what we would normally do, and then just give us kind of a list, like a prioritized list of like the candidates that would stand out, what areas to look out for, what are the specific points on the CV that we should sort of probe and so on, but also like gives us a bit of an idea of like the quality of a candidate. Now, this is all just for screening. So we still go through all of the applications like manually, but it does help us to kind of give us a bit of an idea of like the quality of a candidate, potential quality. And it does help us to also understand whether that was true, whether it's matching the expectations or not.
And do you attempt to, as the output of the prompt, anything quantitative? For example, are you categorizing the applications into like good, decent, not so good, or stack ranking them in some way, or grading them across any criteria?
Good question. Not so much. Again, we don't try to use it because that would introduce quite a bit of bias, and that sort of categorization is done by us manually. So again, we do use it for like sort of a basic screening, but we wouldn't want to go anything beyond. It's just because we have different criteria when we sort of assess candidates, and we do rely heavily on interviews. So this is kind of more old-fashioned, and even in sort of our domain, it's very important that we don't downplay the importance of soft skills and actual like physical interviews, or I mean online interviews at least.
Okay, and so using ChatGPT at that CV stage, and what then is the goal of it? So you're not using it to reject candidates, certainly not automatically. Are you? You mentioned saving time, but you're still reading the CV. So how does it save time for you at the moment? So I guess is one way of framing that.
Yeah, good question. It kind of helps us to go through, especially if you have like a larger quantity of CVs. So usually gives us an indication of what CVs are of lower quality or maybe not even suitable for the specific role that we have. It's really just kind of get through the quantity, but when it comes to the actual quality, that's when we pay more attention to the CVs ourselves or like to specific candidates.
Okay, and it sounds like you've got this prompt kind of quite customized for what exactly you're looking for, or is it across the team and organization and you'll share the same prompt, or is it almost like you've created an Alex bot in a way?
In a way, it's actually an Alex bot, so we don't have it as a framework. We do use like a company account, but we don't necessarily use it in the same way. It's more of just for individually. We still have to do the scorecards. We still have to sort of go through all of the profiles manually, but it kind of personally helps me to understand what sort of applicants I'm dealing with. But it's not like a widely adopted practice in the company yet. And that'll be interesting if it changes at some point.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of that happening. A lot of people kind of just experimenting in different bits of the organization on different problems, which is fascinating to see that kind of innovation. I imagine lots of companies are always creating their own mini products in different bits of the business. And it'll be so fascinating to see where a lot of those land in the next year, as the ones that seem to work well will probably get more widely adopted, and maybe some businesses will might crop up to then really scale that across organizations. These little kind of skunk works I find quite interesting.
Actually, good you mentioned it because this is something that we're also exploring, especially as a data team, because don't know, you probably heard of the concept of service agents. So the idea is to kind of take it like a bit further and not just create a GPT, but actually more of a lookalike of you and somebody that you can go and talk to and somebody that can actually come back to you and ask, for specific follow-up questions and clarify the intent. So that is something that we are exploring. And I've seen it in many organizations, the concept of service agents and this concept of scouts, where you come in and you ask for specific information, you have more of a conversation. But yeah, anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but like it's very much relatable to this. And I feel like within, I guess, hiring, this could be an interesting area.
Absolutely. And you mentioned also something, you mentioned a few times actually, that you're wary of the bias that the ChatGPT or whatever large language model might introduce. Is there any particular bias you're concerned about? And have you thought about perhaps existing biases that we have doing this as humans?
Good question. So I guess it's improving, but the hallucination is a thing. But also, the more you feed it, the more memory you give it, it tends to then, I guess, kind of create preferences for, or like, it's very difficult to sort of control the evaluation score within the GPT because over time it just feels like it degrades. Again, it's improving, and that's why you have sort of the whole new functionality behind keeping memory within the GPT. I don't remember the exact number of messages, but they do get skewed. Sometimes you have to purge them, and that's why it's not necessarily a bias in the context as we humans would know it. It's more of a bias in the sense that it can kind of modify the criteria without you knowing it did. And this sort of a guardrailing of what it should be doing, how it should be evaluating needs to be revised continuously. This is one issue we have with the LLMs today. And again, you can work around it. So I've seen implementations of it where you essentially have human intervention at many steps, which kind of ensures that when it kind of processes a lot of data, it doesn't actually make decisions for you. Because if it did, then those decisions would change very slightly every single time. That's kind of what I mean by biases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Thank you for that. Okay, so we've got then this kind of experimental use of AI in the screening stages. You mentioned also that candidates would be using it for the tests, for creating their own CVs. What do you think about that philosophically? Like, if you knew a candidate had used ChatGPT at every stage of the hiring process and you weren't really interacting with them in a way, or is it more the case of, well, of course you want them to use this groundbreaking tool because they're going to be more productive when they use it in a business? Like, what do you think about the usage of it?
It's a funny one because like it'll be hypocritical if I said I wouldn't like it, because if we are the adopters as well, then the candidates should be free to use it. Um, I quite welcome it. I quite like it when people do use it. The only time that I don't is when it's just a blatant copy paste, essentially. And I've seen some candidates do that, where they forget like about the footnote that GPT leaves you about, or like about the top bit. And it's more funny than anything, because I kind of get it. Like, candidates are desperate nowadays, even within the data domain. The market is not great, right? So there's fewer positions. Companies require broader skill sets, more years of experience, and candidates have to apply to hundreds of applications, 100 job postings. So to me, like, it only makes sense that they use it. It's more of like how they use it. So if you use it, what we call for whiteboarding or storyboarding, where you essentially have it, build up your prompts, even if it takes you an hour, or it take you equal amount of time to create a CV manually, but take your time to build up to it. So then it gives you a better structure, and then refine it yourself. So for that sort of a usage, I'm happy with that, because that's kind of like the new way of working anyway. Like most positions, most roles in companies, this is how they sort of utilize GPT. It's just to kind of create the initial version, you take it away, and then you finish it off manually.
Uh, okay, and what about this as an example? So we were hiring recently, and as part of our application process, part of the assessment process, one of the questions I asked the candidates for this role was, imagine it's day one at Alooba. What are the three things you need from us to give you the best chance of success in your role? So the question was very specific to that person. Like, I cared exactly what their opinion was. I didn't care what they said as long as they told me the truth. I was struck by how many candidates had clearly used ChatGPT for that kind of question, which I felt uncomfortable with, because I don't care what a large language model answered arbitrarily one time. I care what you thought about this. I care about you personally. So is there a limit on the types of things that candidates should be using it for in the hiring process, or is anything fair game, do you think?
That is a really good question. So to me, creating a CV, okay, that's fine. It's almost like listing your skills and past experience. Okay, make it look good. Fine. I think it's the screening questions, and like you just pointed out, like what I appreciate is when somebody goes not in the level of detail like a GPT would, but it's about that added kind of like their own like thought process into it. So to me at that stage, when I usually, because I also use many screening questions, usually 2 to 3, and just to kind of sit through various different levels of experience. When it's used by ChatGPT, that to me it's a no, because again, like, I can Google the answer myself, and that's why I'm doing a screening question. So what's the point of you Googling it and putting it in there? And so at that level, GPT hasn't been very good at like coming up with very original responses. So yeah, I would kind of like agree with you. Screening questions, just even if it's a few lines, just be yourself, answer it. Don't use it. If you want to use your ideas, then use ChatGPT to refine it. Fine, as long as it uses your prompts and your sort of a personal context, where you've defined who you are and you've created almost like a digital footprint of yourself. In that case, ChatGPT can sadly like do a good job at rewording your own words. Most of the time it fails at that, and it really sounds like doesn't sound natural. The only exception could be the O1 preview version. I don't know if you ever used it much. And that one is, yeah, that one is pretty good at sort of crafting better responses. And especially if you give it like really good context. Sometimes it's hard to tell if somebody answered a question using the preview, having modeled the prompts properly, or if it's your own genuine answer.
That's, yeah, a great point you make. I mean, the technology is changing so rapidly. I mean, who knows how indistinguishable his content will be from real human content in a month, 2 months, a year, something like that. Uh, but I think at the moment for candidates, I feel like they should probably be aware of two things. One is if they are applying for a job and part of the application, they've used their real writing and another bit they've used AI, it is very obvious the difference. Because you'll have normal human writing with its imperfections. It's like a typo and a spelling error and hasn't been spaced properly, and they used a word incorrectly, which is fine. And then this amazingly elaborate, verbose, perfectly grammatically correct stuff. It's like they have not been written by the same thing. It's very obvious. So they should be a little bit clever. And the other thing is, if so many other candidates are using ChatGPT, maybe the way to stand out is just to be really authentic in yourself, because then maybe the answers will be obviously yours.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. And also for me, it's also like, oh yeah, of course. I would say like it's also the examples, right? Like you can use ChatGPT, but it will always give you recycled content. It's how it always feels. Like providing like authentic examples, that's something you cannot replace in any application. And some of the best applicants I've had, they only put like a few lines as the response for the screening question. But I knew right away, like it's like, okay, this was something that they did or like they worked on, because it's so imperfect in not in the sense of grammar, but in a sense of the content or the experience they did or the example they provided, how flawed it was. And I thought like, this is great. I want to talk to this person because it's so imperfect as an answer. And that's what works for me. I look for the flaws usually in order to find the best candidates.
What about more holistically? So with or without AI or other tools, like do you have any suggestions for, let's say, new hiring managers, maybe a senior data analyst who's stepping up to a manager of analytics role for the first time, maybe they're doing their first hire. Do you have any suggestions for them on how to hire better, particularly how to screen better?
So for me, it's extremely important that you have like a very solid sort of criteria, like evaluation criteria. So have your scorecard, but then have a clear sort of a understanding of what is a good response, average, and below. And then that gives you like a solid foundation, because especially for somebody that's new, it's very easy to kind of feel like like not connected. Like you can't associate yourself from that person. Sometimes you have the manager bias of like you're looking for someone like you, and it's very difficult to move away from that. And very traditionally, like just have your questions, and then answer those questions yourself, and then think of like what would a good average and below look like in terms of it's the same answer, but there's something else missing in it. So maybe the thought process, maybe that there's a topic around testing that's missing, or maybe it's not about understanding the potential impact of that that involvement of that piece of work that the person was doing. So it's like missing those little pieces, but it's essentially, for me, that's always worked, because originally when I started as a hiring manager, this is the one thing I struggled with a little bit. It's like, to me, all the candidates look great, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm struggling to actually find a good one. It's like, what's happening? And that's what really helped, was actually take a step back. This is something that that my manager taught me eventually, was like, well, go to your scorecard, go to your questions, answer them yourself, and then let's get together and let's reevaluate those answers. And what I kind of did was almost like go through the interview process myself again, but with my manager. And then I would get the feedback, and he would essentially tell me, look, this is the answer. Let's place it on the on the rank, and then we'll see what would make it better and what would make it superb. And then also let's associate specific levels to those answers, because what happens, you tend to have you hire for a specific role, and for that role you have the ranges of answers, but then the role could be a mid-level, but you could end up finding a real gem of a person or candidate, which is a lead. And that's perfectly fine. We are flexible, so let's hire the lead if we want to. So in that case, it's like it's very important you have that sort of a distinction. So long story cut short, do answer the questions yourself. Ideally consult with a more experienced hiring manager, and then craft the responses for each level. And then that will become sort of your framework for evaluating other candidates.
That's such a great answer. And I feel like a lot of the issues, kind of more systemic issues with the way hiring is done, is there's sometimes a lack of real forethought and planning. And you kind of just dive into it, and then you're just interviewing people, and you just kind of gut feeling it the whole way. You're kind of getting to the end. You're like yes or no, doing like a vibe test. And I feel like that's where a lot of these processes run awry. So the fact that you would go to that effort initially to create the scorecard, but then go through it yourself, that's really clever, because then that must also give you empathy with the experience of the candidate as well. And I'm sure it helps you then refine it and maybe make it a little bit longer or shorter or whatever as a result of what you felt going through the process as well.
Exactly. And what you just mentioned, like sometimes, you can end up with a screening process, the questions that are just too long. And it just makes you think when you do it yourselves, like, this is such a waste of time for everybody because that person has to fill it in and I have to read it and evaluate it. And then you realize, okay, let's just stick with the important stuff. And if those two questions could give me what I need in order to, evaluate a candidate initially, great, like that's what I'll do. And I usually end up with two questions. That's about it.
Right. Yeah. There's so much optimization there, isn't there? And picking the right questions and really just trimming it down to those that give you the most insights, I guess. Is that what it is? Like almost like they're covering the maximum number of criteria that you're looking for.
Precisely. And then again, like the process is longer, right? It's multi-step process. So there's going to be an opportunity for you to sort of evaluate other parts, other skills, later on in the process.
So you don't have to put it all into one stage.
No, I wouldn't. I'm actually maybe inefficient as a hiring manager because I interview so many people, but it's also because to me, it depends what organizations you are in, because I worked in larger corporations. I work in scale-ups, now I work in a startup. If you are in a bigger organization, then you can't afford that time. You're going to have thousands of applicants. It's almost impossible. But as you start going to small and small organizations, you get fewer applications, still a lot. But I guess for me, it's more important to, as you get to a manageable amount of applications, to actually go through them manually.
Well, that's probably makes sense. Like if you accept that the most important thing you can do as a leader is hire the best or right people into your team, then maybe we almost underplay how much time we should be spending on hiring. Like maybe it should be half of your job or something dedicated to it. So maybe it's not unreasonable.
Yeah. I wouldn't say maybe half, but I would say like, especially if you're like in a hiring period, it's going to be around 20 to 30% easily, like especially to find a good candidate, because on average it takes roughly 6 months to find like a senior developer. So yeah, that's a long time. At least for me, we don't take it lightly. And it's funny, like the smaller the organization. So now I work in a startup. It sometimes takes us even longer. And then even when somebody joins, that doesn't mean it's over yet. So the evaluation goes on. There's a probation period, which we take very seriously. And also because some candidates lately have become incredibly good at interviewing, it doesn't make them good people or good developers, good engineers, which again, I don't know if it's because of ChatGPT or something else, but you can, maybe as a candidate, you apply for hundreds of jobs, you get really good at it. Again, but then your work performance day to day may not be as good. And we had those situations happen to us.
It reminded me of something one of our guests last week, Vladimir, said. He said, oh, there's a joke during the circles that there's two sets of candidates, those that are amazing at the job but can't interview, and those that are amazing at interviewing but can't do the job. And a little bit cynical maybe, but I've certainly seen that phenomenon.
It is true. It does happen. And I usually look for the one that's sort of in the middle. So they may not be the best at their job, but they're not the worst at interviewing, but somewhere in the middle. Because if you have like a good amount of soft skills, then you'll do better than if you're extremely well competent in your role. Obviously, it depends on the seniority, right? But generally, I always look for someone that, from a technical perspective, is probably not the best, but can grow, but not somebody that's technically extremely competent but can't communicate at all. That to me, it just doesn't work, especially in data. It may work in other parts of engineering where you have like very focused lens and you just sit down and do the job, do architecture. Maybe in larger organizations where you have extremely defined roles and focus roles, but in smaller startups and scale ups, that doesn't work.
And so, yeah, that was going to be my next question around that trade-off or balance between the technical skills and soft skills. So you mentioned straight off the bat that you wouldn't go for someone at either end of the spectrum of either of those, either end of that spectrum, I should say. Uh, Other than communication skills, are there other like really essential soft skills that you're looking for?
Good question, because to me, especially about data, it's all about data, right? So especially in this podcast, um, you communicating the value and the ability to listen, it's like the top two priorities for me. And they're not quite the same. Communicating is about like translating, what you're understanding into words. Listening is it very closely follows. So it's about taking in the information and being relevant and not going sideways or off topic. So again, like you tell me if it's the same, if it falls into the same bucket or not. To me, there's a clear distinction, because one is what comes out of your mouth, the other one what comes into your ears, right? So those would be the top two skills. Obviously, there's other things like empathy and some social skills. But you don't always get that with engineers, and that's fine. It's like I can't expect a extremely confident, likable senior engineer that's highly competent. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have people like that, which is quite interesting, especially people from non-technical backgrounds that got into the field. They do tend to like excel quite well.
You've touched on something really interesting there again, which is for some of these softer skills, there is maybe a level of subjectivity or ambiguity, because you just said, well, communication skills, that could be listening, or that could be its own separate skill, depending on your perspective. When then you're evaluating your candidates on these softer skills, how do you try to do that in an objective way? Is it still part of that scorecard? And if so, do you almost like break down communication skills into sub skills, or like, how do you think about that problem?
Good question. And there's almost like a soft side to the scorecard that we would have, which kind of evaluates the ability to communicate. It's quite simple. It's more like, how much on point are they? Are they going, off topic way too frequently? What's the eye contact? And all of these things that we do have them. Again, they don't make it or break it. As long as the content is good, then we look at the soft side. So it's kind of like technically, depending on the level we are assessing, we try to get a good idea of like your competency, and then we evaluate like your communication skills. The biggest one for us, rather than communicating, because we are quite forgiving, or at least the companies I work for, in terms of people not having the perfect communication skills. They may not be very good at expressing the ideas, but as long as the content is good, we don't mind somebody not being confident, let's say, with the language. The ability to listen was always the one that had a really sort of a big weight in terms of our evaluation. So if we ask you a question and you don't answer, or it takes you two probing questions to get the answer, then it means you're not really good at listening.
Yes, that is probably a great tip there for candidates. I could tell you nothing would infuriate me more, I got to be honest, than someone who just doesn't answer the questions that I've asked them and prevaricates either deliberately or, like, I've noticed for some people that I've worked with, sometimes I feel like it's a defensive barrier where maybe they don't know the answer to the question, or they just want to defer away from the topic because it feels like it's going to be conflict or something. I don't know. And in an interview, it could often feel a little bit like a conflict, but it's just such an annoying trait, I find. And I'd rather just an honest, direct answer.
That is true, and I think that there's like two strategies. So there's some people that just go like try to get out of the question. But to me, what actually really works, like maybe a tip for the candidates, be quiet, take your time, ask for a few seconds to think. It's okay. Actually, as an interviewer, I would prefer to stay quiet for like half a minute, then listen to you about an off topic, or like making up an answer on the spot. That doesn't work.
Yes, directness. And what about succinctness? I guess it's a bit more subjective. Like some people would prefer a more verbose answer that goes into more detail initially. Some would prefer something a bit shorter. Uh, but actually, that leads me on to another kind of sub area. Is I assume for some of these interviews, you would have multiple interviewers. Uh, and can you remember any scenarios where you deviated greatly in how you'd evaluated some of these soft skills? For example, listening or communication. And if so, how did you reconcile those differences in these slightly kind of gray or subjective skills?
That's a good point actually. So when we did group interviews, we do evaluate these, but then we would submit the feedback independently, and then it would be essentially up to one person to sort of evaluate the differences in feedback. But we don't talk about the feedback between us. So it's extremely important it's anonymous because it's a skill that's subjective, right? So to me, somebody could be a great listener, whilst others are like, wait, I mean, like there was probably something else they didn't like. They were not listening. They didn't answer properly, and it maybe comes down to the answer, to the way it was worded. Maybe I was looking for an answer and I got it. Was the other interviewer was looking for their answer. So what works in this, to avoid subjectivity, is to submit the feedback, like autonomously, and then review it. And then everybody should be able to see it. You can't change your responses in your score, but you may be able to, like tell that, okay, maybe the other interviewer was right and I wasn't seeing it. And that's great. So it's up to the final sort of a person that evaluates the feedback to tell us which feedback actually was more valid and then, make a decision.
Uh, what about evaluation tools in the hiring process? So we've spoken about the sort of soft skills versus technical skills trade-off. What about, relying on technical assessments versus different types of interviews? What are your thoughts there? What do you use?
Good question. Changes a lot. Like we used to do like a technical assessment and quite a lot actually. I still use it, but we're changing now for a reason. I'll tell you in a bit. But usually there's a two-part depending on the level of seniority. So one tends to be a technical sort of coding exercise. Do a small project, do a small program, do things like a URL shortener, and just submit your repo. Just show me how you would, use that and design it and make it work. That's always like that's the point of the exercise. If you submit something that doesn't actually run, then yeah, probably we're not able to code it. And I'm not looking for production level. So that's one like a technical assessment. And then there would be a case study. So you go and there's a context, there's a specific audience, and then you have to present something in front of us. Could be a design, it could be a specific architecture, data platform architecture that you should be building. So it's kind of a combination of those two. So a coding and the case study, and then we evaluate both. But we don't always look for the solution. We always look for your ability to defend your solution, and then also think on the spot. So that's how we sort of combine it. So it's not an exercise where you would submit something, and if it fails by default, or if it doesn't work, or it's flawed in design, that you get rejected. Sometimes, of course, we do that. If you have candidates that do extremely poorly in the technical, then yeah, that makes no sense. But for somebody more junior, we tend to have the discussion anyway. So we want to see what you did, why you did it, the way you did.
And as part of that follow-up, where you're digging into their approach, do you ever try to, looking for the right word here, try to give a bit of constructive negative feedback and see how they react to see if they can kind of deal with that criticism? And do any candidates ever not deal with that particularly well?
I would say yes is an answer to both questions. So sometimes we could take a specific, design decision that the candidate did, and it's not wrong, but we frame it in a way as if it was. And then we sort of sit back and see what the candidate comes back with. Are they defensive? Are they understanding? Are they going to admit it's wrong? Or are they going to say, you know what, it's one design choice. I would probably go for some other choices if I had more time. That could be the right answer, right? So we always look to challenge in a good way, and then we just kind of observe, the sort of the response, and that's what the evaluation criteria is for, right? So we look at you, and if you get defensive, that means that yeah, you're probably not conscious of other options, and then yeah, if you do give us a well-rounded answer, you give us potential alternatives, if you kind of start explaining what a production level code would look like, then yeah, that shows a level of maturity. So that's how we use it. So it's essentially, yes, it's a great example of like how to probe essentially.
Yeah, that's such a good way to do it because you're getting to see the candidate's real work. You're giving them a genuine challenge that correlates to their job. If they can produce something that functionally works, to me, like as a startup founder, that's like most important thing. It works. It does what it's meant to. Amazing. Like it really achieved something. But then because you have that follow-up interview, you've got the opportunity for them, or they've got the opportunity to really tell you, well, actually, if this is the real job and I had to make it production ready, here's the improvements I would make without having to do all those things in some ridiculously elaborate task. So I think that's a really clever way to do it.
Exactly. And many times I think candidates forget and they over engineer, and it's a stressful process to be looking for a job. And but my tip would be like don't over engineer. Like be conscious of the limitations. We as interviewers, we love to hear about the limitations. We know that in those 1 or 2 days, you're gonna submit your case, it will never be enough. It will never be good enough. So just tell us why it's broken. Tell us why it's so simple, why it's so almost like primitive. That's a good discussion to be had. And some of the best interviews I had was based on a case study or technical assessment that we only talked about for maybe 5 minutes. The rest of the evaluation of the technical assessment was the potential possibilities of what that person could do or would do if, in other scenarios.
Yeah, and I feel like that's maybe even especially important in startups where often there's a trade-off between speed and quality. And you sometimes might need to do like a quick and dirty MVP hackathon style project, and that's perfectly fine. But then at some point you might need to scale that into a proper product. And so if they thought through some of those trade-offs and they know, I could do 10 minutes of work and get 30 or 50% of the value, then that's probably worth it, rather than something with all the bells and whistles from the get-go.
That is true. And good you mentioned it's good for startups, potentially scale ups. All the scale ups are not a thing anymore. I mean, they are still, but not as much as they used to. But in, I guess, larger organizations, it may differ, right? So it all depends what you're applying for. So it's something to be conscious of, right? So take this advice with like a pinch of salt, right? So as long as you're applying for startups, this is great. It's a good, methodology. For big organizations, I can imagine not, because they're looking for like very like domain experts, right? And that's great. So be thorough in your response. Was for startups, yeah, like you have to know everything, but don't be the one that don't need to do everything. You just need to know about everything a little bit.
If anything, then there's like a meta lesson there about the communication skills, because part of communication is knowing who you're speaking to, who you're pitching to. And if you're even within a hiring process at a startup, your first interview might be with someone from talent acquisition, and your final interview might be with your hiring manager, who's the technical whiz. And the way you communicate what you've done is probably going to have to change dramatically between those two audiences, just as it would if you're applying to a 3-person startup to a founder versus a 100,000-person bank, because of course they're going to be looking for something a bit different.
That is true. That is true. And it's like you've mentioned, like communications is key in this context. I personally like interviewed like I don't remember how many times, dozens of times, like throughout my career, and it always feels like I have to be still fresh in terms of my interviewing skills. But yeah, like it's the ability or the capability to like tailor the amount of content or like the amount of depth you go into at each stage is crucial. So if you talk to a recruiter, why bother them with the low level technicality of a specific solution of an experience? They're looking for achievements. So talk to them about achievements, right? And then as you go further through the stages, then if you're talking to, let's say, a director or specific senior engineering manager, that's when you can go wild with the details if you like.
Uh, so it sounds like your approach is like really very structured, maybe not the right word. Well thought out, well conceived. You've got a scorecard, you've thought through, and it's a considered approach. That's probably the right way to put it. And it's, I'd say, not data driven, but data informed. Like you're measuring and grading people along the whole hiring process. I think it's a great way to do it. Have you ever come unstuck with that approach? Have you ever had a candidate who somehow got to the end of the process, they scored the highest, they were unambiguously the best candidate based on how they've been scored, but then it just didn't work out at all? And there was like something that was missed, like almost an intuition element that was glossed over.
Good question. I didn't have it like in that. I did have one candidate that actually scored really well in all interviews, the assessments. even got an offer, and then it didn't work out 2 months later. And that was like probably my first in terms of like maybe the judgment, maybe the criteria didn't work. There was something that I had missed. And ultimately actually came down to the ambition of that candidate. They didn't like I overlooked it because we were so focused on the assessments, on the interviews, on the screening questions that I didn't necessarily see the ambition of that specific candidate and what is it that drove them to then leave. And ultimately, the reason they left was they just were after a different structure and they wanted a different level of seniority and they didn't want the unstructured life, even though they applied for a startup. And it's something that candidates, again, like I mentioned that before, but like it's tough, like in data, and data teams are smaller and they have to do a lot more work for less pay. Well, not in our case, we pay really well for our people, but still they will lie in throughout the process. And at some point when they get an opportunity that suits them better in terms of their ambition, they will not have an issue leaving. And this is what happened with that candidate. It's like didn't quite work out in the end because it was a mismatch in terms of what that person was expecting and what we could offer as an organization. And it was a little bit disappointing, but it's a good learning experience. So now it's one of the questions that I do ask, but not directly, but sort of indirectly, try to get an understanding of like whether that person would be matching the culture.
That's a great way to put it, isn't it? So you've got a job offer, they are after certain things, and you just got to make sure they overlap well. And I feel like maybe sometimes in the interview process, candidates might be quite guarded over what they truly want. It's almost like a bit of a dance, a bit of a dating experience. You just come out with all your cards on the table. But maybe that's where if you're having these several interviews with different people, you could almost be checking in over the true motivations throughout there, maybe looking for a consistency in what they say. Um, uh, that might help. I personally feel like hiring would be greatly improved if the company and the candidate were as aggressively transparent as possible from the get go. I feel like that would simplify things a lot.
Yes, it would. And I totally agree. Like, and maybe when you say talk about transparency, one thing that I found that actually works really well, at least the way in my process, I'm completely transparent about the roadmap and the importance of that person in that roadmap. So in some of my initial interviews, sometimes I go on like a monologue for like 10, 15 minutes explaining what we've done, where we are, where we stand, what the ambitions of the company are, what I'm doing, who I'm looking for, who I want to work with. So I want to go into that level of detail because that is not that I would maybe, it gives the candidate some ideas, but usually when I'm that transparent, they don't they don't do an echo. They don't repeat what I just said. They actually open up. And so this is something that found out that works really well. Just show your roadmap, be very transparent about where you are, what you've achieved, what are the flaws, what's pending, what's coming up. Because then it gives you, and the candidate kind of gets excited. Like usually, like if they see an excited hiring manager, they get excited in the process and their stress kind of drops and they start becoming more natural. But yeah, this is on your point of transparency. This is how I achieve it. And it works really well.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. Again, then for the maybe newer hiring managers to be transparent. And then you're saying that's almost unlocks transparency from the candidate as well, because they sort of mirror or copy your transparency and they are more open.
It is exactly. Actually, I learned this thing. This was from one of the processes that I was in. So when I interviewed for, there was Databricks, actually. Huge organization now, still ambition as well. Um, the whole process took 6 months, but that's another topic for another story. And it was like 11 stages or something, so it was wild. But there was one hiring I interviewed. It was technical, I think 3 or 4 technical, and then multiple interviews, and then group interviews. It was insane. And but anyway, long story cut short, there was a hiring manager that taught me about this, and he was extremely honest in the interview in terms of like what he was looking for, what he was doing, what he kind of felt like the role would be. And he even told me like, the role I'm hiring for, like he was like being honest. He was like, I'm flexible about like what the role is going to be as long as I get the right candidate. But then he kind of explained the story of what they were actually working on, what were the projects. To me, like I still remember that interview, even though it was like a couple of years back, and it really helped me in that process. And I did stick for those 4 months until the final interview, just because of that experience of the hiring manager. Because I not only opened up, but I actually got very sort of inspired, and I felt motivated, even though it was a long process. And it is just something like, again, on the point of transparency, it's incredibly like useful to have that. Difficult to achieve, especially if you're doing hundreds of interviews. But once you do pull it off with a few very good quality candidates, then it changes the whole process, and you end up finding relevant people.
As a quick share, one company that I've seen who does this really well is a business based in Berlin called Get Your Guide. You might have used their product before. And what I was struck by was how early on in the process they were transparent with this type of information. So they had a way that they could share basically the application stage with the candidates. Yeah, the usual job ad, but also like a day in the life in this team, exactly who your teammates are, the roadmap written down, um, share option valuation information in detail. And so they kind of packaged this information in a bunch of PDFs and shared it with candidates. And what I noticed was that the candidates then had 95% of their questions already answered. And so that de-risks it for them. So if any companies are looking to figure out how to increase like the completion rate of the process, will get the candidates the information they want as soon as possible. And that's surely going to help.
I totally agree. Like it really helps you later on, because if there's a mismatch instead of the expectations, most likely it will come out at the beginning, right? So that's good.
Yes, you don't want to wait until the final interview after 4 months to go, oh, you want 100,000 euros. This only offers up to 80,000 euros. Sorry. That's a disaster for everyone.
That is true, and it does happen more than you would think. And I mean, from your experience, it's your job, so I'm sure you've seen it multiple times.
Yeah, it's sad but true. Yes. Alex, on that funny and happy note, it's been great having you on the show today. It's been really insightful and so well spoken. So really appreciate all your comments.
Well, thank you, team. Thank you for for the discussion. I actually had a good chat. It's quite cool because hiring is one of my favorite topics, and unlike other people, I do enjoy it. So yeah, it's good to have a chat about this with, other like-minded individuals.
Wonderful.